Don't worry. I'll introduce this, and then I have a recap of the chapters we've missed because they're like sort of important. So this is a novel that I wrote, which is it's an AU that hybridizes Bephoris and Alternia. It's called Alternia, but it has a lot of like Bephoran characteristics to it. It's also got most of the Dancestors, all of the Dancestors. All of the Dancestors, all the Rufio has been killed prior to the start of the story. As well as a number of the beta trolls. Yeah.
F's in chat for Rufio.
So yeah, they're basically, it follows this like crew of they're criminals. They're stealing stuff to make money. And there's a little bit of a summary which you can't see on the screen, but I'm just going to read it. So yeah, they've basically been they had this job in the beginning of the story that went really badly. They ended up snagged by a group called the Authority, who are the beta trolls, basically the ones in charge of like, yeah, they're shadow runners basically. And they've run afoul of this kind of like imperial, right hand of the empire kind of group. So we the last chapter we read was Matuna and Latula relationship drama. So chapter 19 is Matuna reflects on how he feels about Latula's infidelity, and we learn he's a lot more hurt and angry about it than he let on, and is having some flashes of intense anger and a desire to hurt her that he realizes are irrational. We learn through a conversation with Kurlos and Matuna that there's something called the deep felt that all the felt cyberspace style interface is built on top of, and that there's something deeply wrong about it. The chapter ends with Matuna reflecting that something is watching him, and then this is a quote from the story. But out there, sitting in the doorway between the conscious and unconscious mind, a presence of unfathomable age and indescribable knowing watched him, waited. And soon he knew he wouldn't be able to resist it anymore. Chapter 20 is Arania, Damara, and Vriska all travel to the fleet research compound to talk to Kanaya, who's the commander there, and another member of the Authority. We get some backstory on Kanaya. Basically, she's in the fleet doing research. She agrees to check on Arania's interface for the cyberspace thing, which for some reason she can't connect to it without potentially killing her. Kanaya discovers there's something like resident in the system that is messing up her ability to log into things, and she unloads that into the computer systems, and Scratch, who is a enigmatic, somehow we don't know what the deal with him is, possibly artificial intelligence, takes over the research complex's computers, and basically says if Arania kills Kanaya that he'll let her go. Chapter 21 opens with Damara seeing Arania holding Kanaya at gunpoint. And Vriska pointing a gun at Arania. Everyone gets disarmed. Arania gets talked down. They find out the facility's in lockdown, and the only way to lift it is to go down to the security office on the lower floors and reset it. And if they don't do that within 3 days, the facility will self-destruct as a failsafe. When they go down to the lower levels, they discover that all the guards have been killing each other, and they find some evidence that Scratch was basically like talking to various guards and telling them, hey, if you kill everyone else, don't worry, I'll let you go, which is almost certainly a lie. Chapter 22 is Kurlos and Mulin talking about Scratch and stuff, and some other backstory on Kurlos, not directly related to what we're reading here. We learn some more about Mulin's backstory and what happened to the whole crew before the story. And then chapter 23 is some more Mina backstory with we learn that artificial intelligence is something that the fleet was interested in, but they couldn't figure out how to make it work. So also Mina is thinks Sporum is hot, and that is important to the story later. But not immediately. So yeah, now we're on chapter 24, which is called Snap Decisions. This chapter in particular has a trigger warning for death and gun violence. So if that's not your bag, you might want to duck out for the next like 20 minutes or so. This is one of the more like intense chapters in the novel. Alrighty. Third day of the 12th Bilunar Perigee, 1st Alternian Fleet, R&D Command Division, North Alternia. Damara swapped the magazine of her carbine out for one of the spares. She wasn't going to take chances on running out of ammo in the middle of a fight, and had no idea whether or not the weapon had already been fired or not. Judging by the blood-soaked massacre a bit further back, that probably wasn't a very likely scenario. But it was better to be safe than sorry. Maybe that was becoming a running theme lately. She felt a twist of pain in her stomach and wondered for a moment if maybe this was it, if the biomods she'd been gifted with all those sweeps ago were finally starting to give out, and she'd collapse right there, right here and now, and it wouldn't matter anymore. Except she knew that wasn't how it was going to work. It had been explained to her in no uncertain terms by the army doctor when she'd been discharged. As her enhanced organs broke down, they would start to give off a rather potent toxin. Eventually, that would build up, and she would just kind of fade. She would pass out, and she wouldn't wake up again. Damara had maybe another 5 sweeps, more or less, and then it would happen. So it wasn't exactly tomorrow, but it was running up on her, becoming more and more likely with each passing day. She was worried about Latula. And wasn't that a strange thought to have? In this place, about to fight for her life, and she was thinking of the red fling she'd had a half a sweep ago. And that wasn't quite right. They'd fought together, not on the battlefield maybe, but they'd been through their own fire together. They'd stood side by side, and maybe that had shifted to the red, at least for Damara. She reached down and grabbed the drag handle on the Tula's body armor. Mulin's blood was still warm on her face, but she wasn't thinking about that. She hauled the Tula back, pulling her toward the relative safety of the bank. Damara closed her eyes and counted back from 10. There was a storm raging inside of her, 1,000 feelings that threatened to blast through the walls and bring her mind crashing down. She couldn't afford to have those feelings in this moment. She opened her eyes and checked the chamber on her carbine. Vriska was standing nearby, smiling. Arania was... Damara looked around. She wasn't sure where Arania had gone.
She went to get one of the rifles,
Vriska said, seeming to sense what Damara was wondering.
She'll be back in a min...
The explosion of a gunshot cut Vriska off in mid-sentence, and she stumbled back, her right shoulder sprouting into a welt of cobalt as the bullet connected. She dropped her carbine with a clatter, screamed, and stumbled back. Damara wheeled to the right to see Arania standing there, holding one of the carbines, pointed at Vriska.
The fuck?
Damara screamed. She turned and leveled her own weapon at Arania.
What are you doing?
Arania ignored Damara and kept her aim on Vriska as she walked forward a few steps.
Don't you get it?
Arania's voice was trembling.
Don't you see what's happening? They'll use us right up until they can't anymore, and then they'll turn on us too!
Vriska was down on the ground, breathing heavily and losing more blood than she ought to. Damara tried to keep her attention on Arania. She tried to keep her voice calm.
Put the gun down. Just put the fucking gun down.
Arania laughed.
What? Are you gonna buy into this too? You think, what, they'll fix you up and you can run off and have your little red thing with Latula and live happily ever after?
That stung to hear, but Damara ignored it.
Fuck, they'll just string us along until they don't need us and then abandon us. It's not like they don't want to.
She was right. The Empire had done it before, had treated them all like disposable props in some larger game. But so did Scratch.
Put the gun down, and we can talk about this.
The words sounded hollow as soon as Damara heard them leave her own mouth. Arania took another step closer.
No.
What's your plan then?
Damara asked.
Kill her and then what? How do you plan to walk out of this?
Arania hesitated. She obviously didn't have a plan for the next part. Instead, she tucked the carbine into her shoulder and aimed at Vriska's head. The burst of gunfire echoed against the metal corridor, and Damara leaned into the recoil. The first round went wide, hitting the metal floor with a spang, but the other two connected into Arania's abdomen. She let out a rough, wet-sounding noise and collapsed back, falling to the floor and dropping the carbine. Damara advanced, weapon still held at the ready, and kicked the falling carbine to the side. She was fighting to keep her own breathing down, to keep the enhanced adrenaline from kicking in and making her do something she would regret.
think this one's Damara?
This Damara, yeah. She couldn't seem to pull any other words out. Arania was acting like she'd lost her damn mind.
What the?
Arania groaned and turned onto her side, breathing heavily.
Scratch wants to rip this all down.
The part where he tried to kill us?
From behind her, Damara heard Vriska struggling to her feet.
You good?
She called back to the other cerulean blood. Vriska responded with a grunt.
Arania, we've been through a lot of shit together, but this is a fucking line.
Damara wasn't trying to conceal the anger in her voice. She was barely fighting to get the adrenaline under control.
You need to stand the fuck down.
Arania lay on her back. She was grinning up at the ceiling. Damara heard Vriska walking up behind her, but she didn't turn.
You sure you're okay?
She called back to Vriska, who only grunted again in return.
We've still got to deal with the security team down below.
You're right.
Vriska muttered from behind.
We do.
In spite of her training, Damara jumped when she heard the bark of gunfire behind her. In the same moment, she saw Arania Circuit's jaw disintegrate into a slurry of cerulean and her head cave in, then expand out in the back as the blue gore splayed out along the steel-gray flooring. Damara heard herself screaming. The adrenaline glands kicked in. In one smooth motion, she turned, took a step forward, and elbowed Vriska in the face with her entire body weight behind the blow. Twisted to the side, her jaw cracked, and she collapsed to the floor in a limp heap. The pistol was lying next to her. Damara grabbed it and shoved it into her waistband. The barrel was still warm. Without thinking, Damara raised up a booted foot and brought it down hard on Vriska's injured shoulder. Then she turned and walked toward the door leading to the access tunnel down to the floors below. She was done waiting for the security team to make their next move. Damara Megiddo descended. Everything was coming through in a reddish-brown haze now. She knew from experience and training that what this was. The secondary glands had already kicked in, flooding her with a cocktail of hormones and stimulants. Under combat conditions, she would be doped up with a dozen other artificial additives to make the effect even more potent. But it was enough. Arania's head was a splattered dot on some godforsaken floor. Damara had been pretty far gone, seeing that happen in front of her. But not completely. That was where the training kicked in. Damara got to the bottom of the ladder, down to the next floor in the labs, and began moving in a fast, rolling walk. Her hearing perked up. Her eyes were sharp. Everything felt so alive in a way that she never got completely used to. She could hear the scramble around the corner. At least two of the security team by the sound of it. Violence of action, that's what they called it in training. Damara swept around the corner and saw three of the guards forming up, looking confused. They hadn't been expecting this. 1, 2, 3. The gunshots rang out in quick succession as Damara leaned back into her training. A neck squelched, a head popped, and a throat gasped for air as the teal blood rushed in to fill the gap where the air was gone. They crumpled to the ground without firing a shot. She dropped the magazine from the carbine and grabbed a new one from her belt without looking. Quick check of the corpses. They were definitely corpses. Well, one of them was still technically breathing. The bullet had missed the spinal column, but he was well on his way out. Keeping the carbine up, Damara kept moving down the hallway. Everything was clear and everything was strangely calm because now her body was doing exactly what they designed it to do. Somewhere deep inside, she could feel a seed of hatred sprouting. Hatred for whoever Scratch was and what the game he was trying to play with them. Hatred for the Empire and everything they stood for. Hatred for what Vriska had done to Arania. Damara moved faster, around a corner, and another corner. A hallway with two guards at the other end, hunkered down by the side of the wall as if it would provide any kind of cover for them. 2 short bursts of gunfire this time. Up the chest and into the jaw. Dead center mass on the other. That one was wearing body armor. She fell back in a stunned crouch. Damara fixed that with a single shot from the carbine. Dead center of the face that time, and a puff of dirty cyan up against the wall meant that guard wasn't going to be getting up again. She dropped the magazine and swapped it for another one from her belt. Down to one left. She crouched down and checked the bodies. pulled 2 magazines from their pouches, and jammed them into her belt. She'd already gotten to the next access tunnel. She hopped onto the ladder and slid down as fast as she could. Damara Megiddo descended. The next floor looked like some kind of administrative space, a plain series of offices and open floors filled with paper-strewn desks. Before she could fully process this, Damara was being shot at. Gunfire spattered from inside one of the open floor spaces. She ducked back down behind a corner and looked for another way around. She could practically feel the guards inside moving to try to flank her. The hallway led down to one side, away from the open space into a series of offices. Damara dashed down the corner, her well-trained footsteps nearly silent on the carpeted floor. Peeking around the corner, Damara saw that the coast was clear, and she moved forward. A series of office doors were to her left, and she imagined that they were next to the open space. She walked to the very last office door on her left and cautiously opened the door a crack. Fortune was smiling on her. There was a large plate glass window that looked out into the open space beyond. Damara could see 2 more guards hunkered down behind desks, frantically preparing to advance to the last position they knew Damara had been in. 7 guards in total. These 2 were probably the last. Violence of action. Damara let the door swing open silently and took her time to aim. A single shot and the closest guard went down hard. His friend dove behind a desk, but she had forgotten a fundamental rule. Cover and concealment weren't the same. And a flimsy wooden desk wasn't cover. Damara switched the carbine to full auto and opened up on the desk, emptying an entire magazine in the space of a few seconds and riddling the desk with holes. She swapped out the magazine and moved through the now shattered window into the open space. The troll who ducked behind the desk was definitely dead. Damara could see her body splayed out even before she was close enough to check that the teal spatter on the carpet was coming from the body. 7 guards in total. Damara felt her head starting to get fuzzy. The combat accelerant was starting to wear off. Even under ideal conditions, it wouldn't last very long. She was going to pass out. Damara was worried about Latula. Half a sweep in the past.
Do you want me to read that?
Yeah, you can read the thoughts.
Okay. I think it was worth it. I think.
Damara had her arms around Latula. The tile of the backroom floor was cool against her warm, naked skin. Latula was soft in her arms. It had been hurried and insistent and good. It had felt good. Maybe. Damara wasn't entirely sure about it. It still felt a little bit on the wrong side, given that she was pretty sure Latula's mate Sprit didn't know about this. But it still felt good. At least on some level, it felt right to her. She shifted, and Latula settled up against her, pressing in close. Maybe at some point, Damara just needed something soft in her life. Needed something to contrast with the pain she'd lived through. Some ray of hope in among the darkness that seemed to be everywhere. Maybe she needed someone to care about.
I think I love her.
That was an emotional roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
Really good though.
Thank you.
I like your action scenes.
Yeah, that's the last one for a while. The next few chapters deal with them sorting through the shit that's happening, and then there's 7 chapters that deal with each character's reaction to Arania's death. So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
F's in chat for Arania.
Thank you, Kit. Yeah, that her death becomes super important, obviously, to the plot and all of the characters' emotional reactions. That was I've talked in the past about a case where I had to carefully consider whether or not the character dying was worth it, and that was the thing I was talking about. Because that was not originally part of the plot. I had a whole arc for Arania planned out. And I was like, well, wait a minute. She's not going to survive this.